Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Wadier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Wadier, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Doing fantastic, my friend. Excited for today's conversation. We're going to be talking all things insulin. What are normal levels? Why don't we test it more? And why it's so dang important. So if you are listening in and this is one of your first times or second times listening, we just want to welcome you in and thank you for giving us a shot, becoming your part of your fasting journey. If you want to learn more about myself or about Tommy, about our journey with fasting and how it's transformed our lives, head back to episode 1, give it a listen. And we really appreciate you listening in today. What a great episode to start too, because we're going to talk about keeping the main thing, which is why fasting is so powerful and how it affects insulin and ultimately weight loss and weight loss resistance, as well as a whole host of other health-related metrics. So if you're a longtime listener, an OG, as we like to say, thank you for continuing to listen. Your downloads and reviews continue to tell the podcast world and podcast gods and goddesses that we are bringing value each and every week. So we appreciate you continuing to show up and continuing to be on this fasting for life journey with us. All right, Tommy.
Yes.
So insulin, and some more insulin. That's where we're going to start. But I want to set the stage first and foremost, before we get into the normals and why it's not tested and kind of explaining a little bit more about it, is really why it matters. So we did an episode back on episode 143, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. 8 out of the top 10 leading causes of death are related to high blood sugar.
Mm.
And we're not just talking about diabetes, right? We're talking about stroke, cancers, cardiovascular disease, chronic lower respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's disease, obviously diabetes, influenzas, pneumonias, kidney disease.
Yeah.
All of these things have a strong relationship to high elevated, long-term elevated levels of blood sugar. So beneath that or upstream from that is this thing called insulin. And it is not the only player in this equation, okay?
Mm.
For there to be fat gain and weight gain, you need to have or weight loss resistance or fat loss resistance. We need to take into account both the hormonal side using insulin and then also the consumption side, the food choices, right? That's why we say fasting is a 2-part equation. Fasting, you can fast, you set the timer, you limit your foods, you don't eat, time restricted eating for a period of time. And then on the other end is, okay, well, what food choices are you making when you break your fast? And one of the biggest things we see, one of the biggest mistakes is you don't intentionally put decisions into that window. And it's just kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? So when we look at insulin, there is also an insulin resistance side and an insulin sensitivity side, meaning the effectiveness of how your insulin works.
Mm-hmm.
So as we walk through what is normal levels of insulin, the takeaway here is what are we going to eventually be able to do to reduce, prevent, and control this thing that really isn't understood well in mainstream medicine and or tested for often.
Yeah, and we get a lot of questions about it too. We just got one just a few days ago, which was something along the lines of, hey, what about this whole insulin resistance thing? If I'm insulin resistant
It came in this morning.
now, yeah. Okay. Was it this morning? Yeah. I'm insulin resistant, or if I am insulin resistant, is that forever? Will I always be that way? Can it be reversed? To what extent? How long does it take? All of the nitty gritty, that's correlated to a number of other things, including the weight, but also food choices, like you mentioned. And so there's a lot to unpack there. But the reason why I brought that up was because just understanding that it's almost like you can think about it as your cellular sensitivity to a hormonal compound that's coming out for a lot of different reasons in the body from the pancreas in relation to what you're doing, what you're eating, how much blood sugar has risen or has dropped over time. And it's correlated with things like food choices, like sleep and sleep deprivation, cravings, exercise level, how much fat you actually have around your midsection, your visceral fat. Those are hormonally active fat cells that actually influence the release of more insulin. So you have a bit of a positive feedback loop, if you will, with insulin resistance as well. So the point here being that no, if you're insulin resistant now, you are not doomed to stay that way, but it's a matter of like progressive numbness, if you will, like cellular numbing to the signal of the insulin. So it's like your cells have seen it, so much of it, so often for so long that they start to become numb to it. And it's a process that can take some time and correlated to the weight to start to reverse that, kind of peel back those layers of the onion to get back to healthier levels of sensitivity over time.
I want to talk about a study, and it was the effect of sustained physiologic hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia on insulin secretion and insulin sensitivity in man. That's a mouthful. I want to come right back to that. First, I want to describe what insulin is. So it's a hormone. It's a chemical messenger, circulates through your bloodstream, triggers physiological events. It has an effect on every single cell in your body, including bone, brain, muscle, and skin. And of course, all of the cascades that happen with metabolization of energy storage versus fat burning versus fat storage. So insulin, brain, ears, heart, muscle, fat, liver, reproductive organs, nerves, right? So insulin's anabolic in nature. It promotes growth in bones and skeletal muscles and other tissues in the brain. It can govern cognition. That's why we're starting to see, type 3 diabetes being Alzheimer's and dementias falling into the category of it being an insulin and a blood sugar problem, not a plaque development problem. And in the liver, which is a huge place that we need to put some focus or shine the light on when it comes to insulin, is it helps synthesize alternative energy sources such as glycogen and fatty acids. So fat production and short-term 24-hour energy stores. So when we think about this, your digestive tract, when you eat, will break down carbohydrates and food and produce energy. So carbs stimulate insulin the most, protein the second, and fats the least. Right? So glucose is the primary source chemical energy in the body. We're not talking about ketones or keto production, or if you've been fasting and you're getting into ketosis, or maybe you're doing a keto diet, but just in a normal, like everyday process, you eat, it breaks it down in energy. And then the insulin is secreted by the pancreas, which helps shuttle glucose from the blood into your cells for energy use or storage. Right? So you were talking about these blood sugar spikes, and you were talking about the symptomatology of what insulin resistance can be on a day-to-day basis. But these big spikes cause repeated insulin surges. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a big spike from the Dairy Queen blizzard, right? It can be repeated spikes from snacking and grazing and keeping your fasting window open too long. Even some forms of medications. Even a protein shake, right? Quick absorbing, boom, goes right in. So that's why we talk a lot about in our programs, making sure that we're putting protein and fat first, right? And then, or fiber, protein, and fat, right? So eat your veggies, eat your protein, eat your fat. And then on the back end, consume the carbohydrates, because it blunts that blood sugar response. But the more and more, the way you described it is, I think of it like the Muppet Babies, like back in the day when the nanny would come in and it would just, you just hear like, wah, 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 wah. Like, I think that was the sound, right? And you couldn't make out her words, right? It was just this numbing sound, right? But what happens is eventually, after repeated exposures or wants, right? And your body's not hearing it, your cells aren't producing it. Your body can't keep up or make enough insulin to keep up with the glucose production or the glucose ingestion, right? Or the blood sugar that's floating around in your body. So it stays chronically high. And that's when we see diabetes, heart disease, cognitive decline, reproductive issues, cancers, and more. The problem is that insulin resistance can start in the muscle cell long before it shows up in the bloodstream. So one of the things why insulin resistance hasn't been looked at very often, and it's not part of routine blood work, is because some people still don't see insulin as a precursor to other health problems. And then we have if you actually do test for it, then what the heck do you do with the test? How do you interpret it? And we'll get into that in just a minute.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to always limit the actual utilization of figuring this stuff out, like what's going on under the hood. If the next step is kind of a question mark or an unknown, I mean, what provider is going to want to be, face to face, like, okay, well, now we have some new information. Great. But I'm not really sure what to do with it. So we're left knowing that this is an important thing. Okay. So what to do about it? So when we start understanding, okay, blood sugar is related. We have blood sugar sensors all throughout our body, and they understand what's happening with our blood sugar. They know if it's on the rise or on the decline. And then this is leading to more or less of bolus and dripping out of insulin from the pancreas, from the beta cells in the pancreas. And so then if we can understand it like that, then it starts to make sense why a few of the things that you've alluded to already, like how long is my eating window open on a given day? What are some of my food choices, even down to, if I have a particular plate or a particular meal, but it's in a different order, it might have a different effect on my blood sugar and thus
100%.
on my insulin response, which is kind of crazy. I'd say it's crazy when you're in the tracking world, because as long as I stayed in the tracking world, that right there never felt like big enough to feel like a big needle mover. It was like, no, I have my calories. I even have my macros. I'm already tracking those. The order of the food that I'm actually eating, it can't matter. It can't matter enough to move the needle and move the scale. But in fact, it does, because your body is actually constantly seeing what's going on with your blood sugar, and how you actually eat that, how it comes in, actually does have a big effect. So if I break a fast with a higher, more like a faster acting blood sugar spiking agent, simple carbohydrates, that is going to immediately start raising my blood sugar, which is going to immediately shoot out insulin that can't really be turned down. That already happened. The blood sugar is already starting to spike at that point. Whereas if I had started it in a different way with some protein, with some good fats, and left that for later in the meal, or even just a few minutes later, it can definitely have a different effect on blood sugar, which is crazy.
Yeah, man. And that's why, so I want to go back to that research article that I mentioned in just a second, but the insulin dysfunction, the insulin resistance, the root contributing factor to what we mentioned, all those different disease processes, more than 133 million Americans and up to 88% of adults have an issue with this process that we're talking about right now. Let's talk metabolic health. Like, it's the way our bodies make and use energy. And that's where insulin comes into play. It's the gatekeeper, right? This is why the CGM has been so incredibly impactful at different stages of my fasting, weight loss, and health journey. And right now, I'm in part of a 6-month tracking period, and we've partnered with NutriSense. So NutriSense combines cutting edge tech and expert dietitian expertise. So a human component. So you get to see what you were just talking about, how your body responds to different food, exercise, stress, and sleep, right? So not just the food component and the insulin component, because it's not testing insulin. I'll explain that in just a second, but it's looking at how your blood sugar varies, which means insulin is there, like trailing it, right? Blood sugar trails the insulin response, right? So NutriSense has the ability in real time, by pairing the technology, which is the continuous glucose monitor that you wear in your arm, completely painless to apply. It lasts for 2 weeks. And you get a package of sensors when you sign up for a 6 or a 12-month subscription. And it actually shows you, am I moving closer or farther away to getting my insulin under control? Because is my area under the curve with my blood sugar response, is it getting smaller or bigger? How big are my spikes? How long do they last? What if I eat this? What if I eat that? What if I do change the order that I eat my food in, right? So the key here is your blood sugar levels are going to vary based on your body's ability to produce insulin, which is then going to have a level of effectiveness, right? You're going to see in real time. It's going to allow you to see it on your app. You're going to have expert dietitian guidance from their team to explain what the heck the ratings are when you look and one's green and one's red. You're like, why'd I get a red? My blood sugar was low. Well, your variability wasn't where it needed to be. And it's really simple to walk out, because it makes it easy to identify and control what you're doing well and where there's room for improvement. So especially for me, it's been key at this point in my journey, as it was in previous points, where now I'm really working on keeping that area under the curve, like keeping my blood sugar pretty stable for as long as I can, because I'm really working on some visceral fat, some visceral adiposity, right?
Yeah.
And for me, I've been doing more carnivore. I've been trying to control my cravings and get that insulin number down that we're going to talk about here in just a minute. So if you go to nutrisense.io/fasting for life, nutrisense.io/fasting for life, you'll get a $30 off code, and you'll get 1 month free of dietitian support. And I just really encourage you, as we're talking about insulin, the reason it fits so perfectly with today's conversation is because there is no at-home insulin test like there is a test for blood sugar, which NutriSense does. But we can still get insight into what our insulin's doing, while you then go strategize, okay, how am I going to get my fasting insulin number? And then
Right.
what am I going to do to interpret it? So that's the next
Yeah.
piece of today's conversation that I want to talk about is why is this not something that's ordered? Why is fasting insulin? Well, there's two main reasons. There's no scientific consensus on optimum insulin levels because it was always thought as a lag measure, not a lead measure when it comes to disease, right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
secondarily, there was some issues with accuracy with the testing process.
Mm.
So as of late, there has definitely been, how do I say this? More accurate, the more variables you have. So for instance, this woman asked about, once I get my insulin tested, what's my number? We'll talk about numbers here in just a second. Is it high? Is it low? Where should it be? Well, it's not the entire piece of the puzzle. We also need to look at waist circumference, height to waist ratio, triglycerides, HDL, ApoB, right? There's other
CRP.
factors, CRP, inflammation, familial history, right? Those types of things as well. So it is a powerful piece because once you have an insulin number and a blood sugar number, then you can look at something called the HOMA-IR, which is the gold standard. But I'm putting the cart before the horse. So let's take a step back for just a second and talk about, Tommy, the discrepancy, right, between Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. D'Agostino, Dr. Perlmutter, Dr. Ben Bickman, and Dr. Robert Lustig all have different levels of where they think and these are researchers and pioneers in this space, right, on where they think the normal levels should be. And, to be honest, I had a client recently who was like, I went and asked for this test and my doctor refused to order it. And I said, okay, we'll go to Any Labs Test now here in Houston, order it yourself. Okay, great. Now I have the result. What do I do with it? I Googled.
Right.
Now I'm confused.
Yeah, that's actually what I ended up having to. I actually utilized a NutriSense at-home lab kit to get mine rechecked. And so, that can be a frustrating part of the process. I guess it's part of why we hear these kind of questions a lot because, like you just alluded to, we have 5 different PhDs and clinicians here as well in a mix and no consensus on exactly what the best number is. Although when I look back at some previous lab work and some friends of mine shared with me theirs while they were on their weight gain journey and now trying to figure out how to get the weight off, a few of them showed me some alarming insulin numbers that their doctors had recently ordered for them. They were trying to decide if they were putting them into the pre-diabetic, bucket or you're right on the edge here. Do we need to get, a medication involved
Right.
for this? And a few of them were like right there on the line because what we do normally see is, well, you're going to want it under 25. So what that's meaning is that sometimes on the lab work, if it's at 24.8, it's not showing up as any sort of red flag. And that's a problem because that is crazy, crazy high.
But that's even if it gets ordered.
Yeah. Well,
right. So then you order it and you're like, oh, I'm at 22. Okay, I guess I'm normal. Well, guess what? I was at 22 and I was fat and I was sick and I had a ton of visceral fat and my blood pressure was up and my liver enzymes are off and I was on my way to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and diabetes.
Right.
And it was like, well, what the heck? Right. So the chronically elevated, and I was doing CrossFit. I had a $10,000 functional nutrition coach. I was working out. I was not stopping and getting fast food and Dairy Queen and pizza on the way home. I was literally doing this program with my wife, right? Yeah. Like I wasn't a bad patient, right? I was walking it out for 6 months and the needle barely moved. But once I started adding fasting in, then I really started to see some incredible change really quickly. So I mentioned this research article because there's this thing with insulin and they did this in a lab test. Like why this matters, why someone without blood sugar or diabetes related issues would worry about insulin.
Sure.
Well, here's the thing. So they did this test and they were looking at 72-hour and 96-hour hyperinsulinemia states, meaning high levels of insulin. And it was done in a lab. And their takeaway was that these results demonstrate that chronic physiologic hyperinsulinemia, elevated insulin, whether created by exogenous infusion, which is what they were doing in the lab, or by stimulation of endogenous, meaning your own body's production of insulin, leads to development of insulin resistance, which is characterized by a specific defect in your glycogen synthetic pathway. So how your body literally uses energy. There's a defect in your cell, in your muscle cells, in your liver. It's not processing the energy properly. So limit your calories. Great. Start working out more. Great. The needle doesn't move month after month. Well, guess what? There's a resistance there, right? So they say that these findings indicate that hyperinsulinemia should be considered not only a compensatory response to insulin resistance, but also as a self-perpetuating cause of the defect in itself. So all of that word jargon that I just said means it's a negative feedback loop. So how are we going to get off of that crazy train? right? If they're able to do that in just 48 hours inside of a lab, inside of humans, and these were in healthy individuals, right?
Yeah.
To be able to create that, then we need to start looking at how do we get the test? Where's our number? And then that becomes part of our tracking every 3, 6, 9, or 12 months, rather than your just routine yearly blood work, which isn't even going to have this on it. Does that make sense? So let's go over the ranges that we see, right? So 2 to 5, 2 to 6, 8, less than 8. Dr. Ben Bickman, less than 10. Dr. Rob Lustig, less than 10. We like to see, I know personally for me, when I got my number under 5 is when I really started to see change. My wife's at 2 point something. Tommy, you're in the 3s now, right?
Yep, I am. Yep.
I started at 22, right? Study of Chinese men. They looked at it, found the insulin levels ranged. Their average was about 16. There was another study that said 15. Indian participants, 17. Korean adults without diabetes found that people with insulin levels around 10. So there isn't an actual like gold standard for this, but if you get, we like to see, and what we see in most of our folks is that the cravings, the lifestyle, the lab work, all of the other related labs improve when you get into that around that 5 to 6 range.
Yeah.
Right. The cool thing is if you get a fasting blood sugar with that, you then can put that into the HOMA IR equation. And the HOMA IR equation has absolute data to back up that if your number is 1 and under, you are a healthy, non-insulin resistant individual. It varies on the high end, 1.7, 1.8. But if you take that fasting insulin number, combine it with your blood sugar number, now you got a HOMA IR, which we've done a whole podcast episode on as well. Okay, now we have something as a reference range, not just one data point that is going to confuse us because there's no medical standard for it because it's seen as a lag measure, not a lead measure in disease. And then the doctors in the system don't have any way to help you do it. Well, guess what? That's why we fast. That's what transformed our lives with the process of how we started and the one word you use that we like to use is always consistent, intentional fasts.
Yeah, it absolutely, that's a great point to highlight because if we're actually looking back at what those numbers were doing over time, I want to say this, when my insulin was at 3, it got into the 3s. I didn't have all the weight off. I wasn't at the perfect number.
Same. I've still got a few pounds of visceral fat and my number's in the 5s. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the really cool thing.
Of course you're beating me. Thanks. Jerk.
Oh, well, hey, who's counting? I love a good competition, but I just love the fact that
you got the test done, sneaky. It's good stuff.
You don't have to have the perfect body composition. You don't have to have all the weight off to start getting a really, really good handle on that, but the consistency is going to matter. And hey, that's what a CGM helped me get some of that consistency under my belt. Even just like being really intentional about my fast. This isn't always about hitting home runs. This isn't about multi-day fast. Those multi-day
rolling
fasts
72s, 7-day fast once a month. Unless you're trying to I don't know, man. That's not sustainable, right? What do you do when you stop fasting?
There's a lot of decisions whenever you stop the fasting. So it can almost be like, if I feel like I'm avoiding decisions, then I know, hey, I need to be doing some shorter fasts, but I need to be getting those right more often, more of the time, because we're talking about fasting insulin levels. I mean, that's stuff that's baked into the system in your blood work. That's going to be over the last 30 to 60 days. I mean, it's going to take a while to move the needle on that. And it's going to take some consistency to get somewhere different 30 or 60 days from now when you retest.
There was an article that we were reading and what disagreed on whether or not in my own head, whether or not we should do an episode on it. And it was talking about the differences. And we've referenced this a few times in the past too, about whether or not we should actually be looking at certain lab metrics in a fasted or non-fasted state. Over the last 10 to 15 years, it's like, well, we should actually be looking at some metrics in a fasted state and some not when you have your routine blood work done. Well, guess what? Wow. There's no disparity here. Fasting insulin, go get it done. And now you have an interpretation, right? You have a number that you can track that is moving the needle away from metabolic disease and all of the conditions we mentioned earlier, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, et cetera.
Yeah.
And you're, again, just a piece of the puzzle, but the easiest way to get control of this and stop the want, that numbing that you mentioned is to fast consistently and make better food choices when you break your fast. And if you're looking for guidance on that, you can head to the show notes and grab our blueprint to fasting for fat loss. It's a free 20-page PDF. It gives you some schedules, outlines the what, the why, talks big picture, but also gives you some tangible, actionable things you can do as well. And if you want a subjective quiz, we have an insulin assessment as well, where it tracks and it allows you to score it. And it tracks your total score if you say yes or no to the questions on some of the other symptoms that go along with having insulin resistance or elevated insulin while you're trying to figure out how to get your fasting insulin test, Tommy. So one takeaway from today, Tommy, for you, as we wrap up today's episode, head to the show notes, Fasting for Fat Loss Blueprint. The insulin assessment is on our website, thefastingforlife.com. You can also head and click the link to join the Fasting for Life community and talk all things fasting 24/7. So one takeaway, Tommy, as we wrap up today.
Yeah, I love it. A takeaway for me is let me get some consistency going here. So regardless of how much experience you have with fasting or what your longest fast is, we're looking for consistency here in both my ability to set my timer and then complete the intended fast, as well as the choices that I'm putting on my plate whenever I am breaking my fast, because those are the two things that are going to add up the most. They are going to have the biggest impact on my insulin resistance and my fasting insulin number whenever I do have it checked. So getting those two and checking those boxes consistently rather than swinging for the fences, especially if you haven't been knocking it out of the park lately, then absolutely go do that. Go focus on the consistency, make one or two better food choices today and tomorrow, and keep that ball rolling. And you're likely to see an improvement here in some of the things that we've been talking about today that are so important.
Absolutely love it, Tommy. As always, appreciate the conversation. Sure, head to the show notes. Check out NutriSense. Been inspirational. It's now part of a signature piece of our programs. We've been working with them for a while. Just an incredible experience. Tommy, as always, thank you, sir, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye.
So, you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.